What would you do if the thing everyone called a ghost story was real? For 100 years, the people of the Arizona Territory whispered about the Blackwood Six, an outlaw stagecoach that vanished into the canyons with a fortune in unminted gold. They said it plunged into the earth, a mule-drawn phantom taking its secrets with it. But the truth waiting inside wasn't gone. It was just sleeping, waiting for the right kind of storm and the right kind of woman. Stay close as we tell her story. Pearl Harker arrived in the town of Redemption with the dust of 3 states on her worn hymn and the quiet emptiness of a new widow in her eyes. Her husband, Tom, had left her with a heart full of good memories and a pocket full of nothing. The claim he'd worked himself into the grave for had been swallowed by a company with more lawyers than she had dollars, and so she was set adrift. She came to Redemption not for its name, but for its location, a hardscrabble dot on the map at the edge of a vast, uncharitable wilderness, a place where a person could disappear and be left alone. She had her husband's old leatherworking tools in a canvas roll, a stubborn mule named Dust, and a silence that clung to her like a second skin. The town itself was little more than a single street of false-fronted buildings baking under an indifferent sun. The livery, the saloon, the general store, and a church whose steeple seemed to be pointing an accusing finger at the sky. She found work at the livery, mending tack for a man named Henderson, who paid her less than he paid the boy who swept the floors, but offered a small, windowless room at the back. It was enough. Pearl didn't ask for comfort. She only asked for a place to put her hands to work, to feel the familiar bite of the awl in her palm, the pull of waxed thread through tough leather. The repetitive motion was a balm, a way to mark time without having to think about all the time she had lost. She worked from sunup to sundown, her world shrinking to the smell of horsehide and oil, the rhythmic scrape and pull of her tools. The townspeople watched her. They saw the slight, wiry woman with sun-browned hands and a face that held its sorrow close. They saw the way she never looked a man in the eye for too long, the way she moved with a weary purpose that spoke of a life already lived. They whispered, "A widow. Lost her claim. Got nothing left." She was a curiosity, then a fixture, as unremarkable as a fence post. Pearl felt their eyes on her, felt their pity and their judgment, and she met it all with the same quiet stoicism she gave to the rising sun and the setting moon. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was low and raspy, as if unused to the air. Her only conversations were with Dust, the mule, whose soft, whiskered nose would nudge her shoulder in the evenings as she gave him his measure of oats. He, at least, asked nothing of her but consistency. In the quiet of her small room, with the scent of leather filling the air, she would listen to the wind as it poured out of the yawning mouth of Diablo Canyon just beyond the town. It was a lonely sound, a high, mournful song that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten stories. A storm broke over the territory in the 2nd month of her stay, a violent biblical deluge that turned the dusty street of Redemption into a river of mud. It was a gully washer, the old-timers called it, the kind of rain that didn't just fall, but clawed at the earth, rearranging the landscape as it saw fit. For 2 days, the world was a gray sheet of water and the constant roar of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. Pearl sat in her small room, listening, feeling the immense, impersonal power of the weather. It was a force that cared nothing for claims or deeds, for widows or wealthy men. It simply was. When the rain finally stopped on the 3rd morning, the world was scrubbed clean, reborn. The air was sharp and cool, and the light had a crystalline quality, making everything seem new and strange. Henderson sent her out to check the fence line along the canyon road, worried that the flash floods had taken out a section. She saddled Dust and rode out, the mule's hooves sinking into the soft, damp earth. The canyon was transformed. Waterfalls cascaded from its rim, and the creek at its bottom, usually a trickle, was a churning brown torrent. She was tracing the fence, her eyes on the ground, when some instinct made her stop. A feeling, a shift in the air. She looked up. High on the opposite wall of the canyon, a massive slab of sandstone had sheared off, exposing a fresh, pale scar on the rock face. And there, revealed on a newly created ledge, was a shape. It was dark, splintered, and impossibly out of place. It was wedged between two pinnacles of rock, canted at a strange angle. A broken skeleton hung against the sky. Her breath caught in her throat. Even from this distance, she knew what it was. The long, rectangular body. The high driver's box. The ghost of a wheel hub. It was a stagecoach. It was the Blackwood Six. The legend she'd heard whispered in the saloon, the campfire story told to frighten newcomers, was real. It was there. A coffin in the sky, its 100-year vigil finally broken by the storm. She stood for a long time, just staring, her heart hammering against her ribs, the wind carrying the faint, creaking sound of its rotted timbers all the way across the chasm. Was it just a wreck, a hollow shell picked clean by time and birds? Or did a century-old secret still wait inside that wooden skeleton, a fortune in outlaw gold? What would you risk to find out? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of this incredible story. Because when Pearl Harker decided to climb, she wasn't just chasing gold, she was chasing justice. Pearl kept the sight of the stagecoach locked away inside her, a secret that burned like a hot coal. She knew she couldn't reach it alone. She needed ropes, gear, and more importantly, a man who knew how to use them. A man who wouldn't laugh her out of the room or try to cheat her. She began to listen more than she spoke, catching snippets of conversation at the livery and the general store. She watched the men of the town, trying to gauge their character. Most were loud and boastful, their confidence built on drink and bluster. She saw the avarice in their eyes when they spoke of money, and knew she could trust none of them. Her quiet inquiries were met with suspicion. When she asked Henderson who the best climber in town was, he just squinted at her. "Best you stay out of that canyon, Pearl. It's got a long memory." Finally, desperate, she let a piece of her secret slip. She mentioned to the livery boy that she'd seen something queer up on the canyon wall after the storm. The boy, eager for a story, embellished it until, by noon, the entire saloon was buzzing with the news that the widow Harker had seen the ghost of the Blackwood stage. That afternoon, Jedediah Thorne held court from his usual chair in the saloon. Thorne was a big man, florid and loud, whose family had founded the town and owned half of everything in it. His wealth gave his opinions the weight of fact. When Pearl entered the general store, his voice boomed from across the street, carrying easily through the open doors. "The widow's seeing ghosts," he bellowed, followed by a chorus of sycophantic laughter. "That old wives' tale? My granddaddy heard that same story." He caught her eye from across the dusty street and winked, a gesture not of friendliness, but of dismissal. "Some things are best left buried, girl. You'll find there's nothing in that canyon for you but a long fall." The laughter followed her as she gathered her meager supplies, her face burning with shame. His words were a public branding, marking her as a fool. She left the store, her eyes downcast, her resolve crumbling. As she passed the shaded bench outside the assayer's office, a hand, dry and papery as an old leaf, reached out and gently took her arm. She looked up into the roomy, startlingly clear eyes of a man everyone called Old Man Hemlock. He was a prospector who had been in the hills so long he seemed more a part of the landscape than a man. He smelled of dust and pine and something ancient. He didn't smile. He leaned in, his voice a dry rustle. "Don't you mind them," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the canyon's distant rim. "They're afraid of the truth." He paused, his grip tightening for a moment. "The dead keep better ledgers than the living." Then he let go, turned, and shuffled away without another word. Pearl stood frozen on the boardwalk, Thorne's loud mockery ringing in one ear and Hemlock's cryptic whisper in the other. The words made no sense, but they landed in her with a strange weight, a puzzle piece she didn't know she was missing. She looked from the saloon, full of noise and laughter, to the silent, waiting canyon. She felt more alone than ever, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than despair, defiance. There was one name she had heard spoken in quieter tones, a man who kept to himself. Silas Valle, a former lawman, they said, who had traded his badge for a small ranch north of town after some trouble down south. He was known for his silence and his skill with horses, and for the fact that he came to town only when he had to. He was her last hope. Pearl found him shoeing a big roan in front of the blacksmith's forge, his back to the street. He was lean and weathered, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of deep competence. She waited until he was finished, her hands clasped in front of her. When he finally turned, his face was calm, his eyes a startling gray that seemed to take in everything at once. She told her story simply, without embellishment, her voice low but steady. She told him what she had seen and what she wanted to do. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss her. He looked at her calloused hands, the set of her jaw, and the unwavering honesty in her eyes. When she was finished, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the hiss of the forge and the distant cry of a hawk. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements deliberate. "Jedediah Thorne tell you to leave it be?" he asked, his voice a low baritone. Pearl just nodded. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Silas's eyes. He looked up at the canyon rim, then back at her. "A man who tells you to leave a thing buried is usually the one who put it there," he said softly. He studied her for another long moment. "I'll help you," he said finally. "Not for a share, for a day's wage. I'll give you 2 days of my time. If we find anything, it's yours. But you follow my lead, no arguments." Pearl felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. "Thank you," she managed to say. "When can we start?" Silas looked toward the rising sun. "Dawn," he said. "Be ready." They set out the next morning, Pearl on her mule, Dust, Silas on his sturdy bay. They carried coils of rope, hammers, iron pitons, and a heavy canvas tarp. The air was cool and clear as they rode toward the canyon, the silence between them comfortable, born of a shared purpose. The journey to the base of the cliff was harder than Pearl had imagined. There was no trail, and they had to dismount and lead the animals through a maze of rockfalls and thorny scrub. As they drew closer, the scale of the canyon wall became overwhelming. It was a sheer face of red and ochre rock, rising hundreds of feet into the piercing blue sky. And there, impossibly high, was the stagecoach. It clung to the cliff like a wasp's nest, looking fragile and menacing all at once. It seemed an insane task. They made their camp for the night in a small, sheltered cove at the base of the wall. Silas built a small, smokeless fire, and they ate in silence, the immense presence of the cliff looming over them. As darkness fell, the stagecoach above them seemed to merge with the stars, a dark constellation telling a forgotten story. The wind whistled through its broken frame, a sound like a long-held breath, and Pearl felt a strange, unnerving sense of homecoming. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The climb began at first light. Silas went first, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that belied the difficulty of the ascent. He tested every handhold, every foothold, his movements economical and sure. He drove pitons into the rock face, securing the rope as he went. 3 points of contact at all times, he instructed Pearl, his voice calm and low. "Don't look down. Look at the rock in front of you. Trust the rope." Pearl, wiry and light, followed in his path. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down, focusing on the rough texture of the sandstone beneath her fingers, the solid feel of the rope in her hand. Her life depended on this man, this practical stranger, and on the strength of her own nerve. It took them 2 hours to cover the 150 feet to the ledge, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. When they finally hauled themselves onto the narrow shelf of rock, they stood for a moment, catching their breath, not looking at each other. The stagecoach was a ruin. Up close, it was even more ravaged by time than it had appeared from below. The wood was bleached gray and splintered, riddled with holes from woodpeckers and insects. The axles were broken, the wheels gone, likely tumbled to the canyon floor a century ago. The leather of the driver's seat was cracked and peeling away, revealing the horsehair stuffing beneath. The name on the door was just a ghost of paint, but Pearl could trace the letters with her finger, Blackwood Express. A wave of disappointment washed over her. It was just a wreck. A hollow shell. Anything of value would have been taken by the outlaws, or by the first person to find it after the crash. Silas moved carefully around the coach, testing the floorboards, examining the frame. "It's wedged in here tight," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The impact must have driven it into the rock. Pearl ran her hands over the splintered wood, her senses taking in the dry, dusty smell of its decay. This was the source of the legend, the object of Jedediah Thorne's mockery and Old Man Hemlock's cryptic words. It felt inert, empty. She moved to the driver's box, her mind replaying Thorne's dismissive laughter. She ran her hand along the edge of the seat, where the rotted upholstery had pulled away from the frame. Her fingers, sensitive and trained by 1,000 hours of feeling for imperfections in leather, brushed against something that didn't belong. It was smooth and cold under a flap of decaying fabric. She pulled the material away. It was a small, flat plate of dark metal, no bigger than her palm, fastened to the heavy wooden frame with 4 flush-headed screws. It looked like a repair, perhaps, but it was too neat, too deliberate. And it was hidden. Why hide a repair? A small, discordant detail in a scene of total destruction. A question mark. She didn't say anything to Silas, who was still examining the undercarriage. She just pressed the fabric back over the plate, the cold feel of the metal imprinted on her fingertips. A single clue that refused to fit the story of an empty, forgotten wreck. They couldn't work safely from the narrow, crumbling ledge. The risk of a fall, or of dislodging the coach itself, was too great. "We need a better way," Silas said, his eyes scanning the canyon rim high above them. "A platform. We work from above." The decision meant a delay of days, a commitment of labor that went far beyond the 2 days Silas had promised. When Pearl looked at him, a question in her eyes, he simply nodded. "The job's not done," was all he said. And so began a week of grueling, back-breaking work. They hauled their gear out of the canyon and spent a day scouting the rim until they found a spot directly above the wreck, a place where a set of gnarled junipers offered a solid anchor. Then the real labor began. They constructed a small, sturdy wooden platform, just big enough for one person to stand on, and rigged a system of ropes and pulleys to create a bosun's chair, a way to lower themselves down the cliff face. It was hard, repetitive work, and it forged a silent bond between them. Pearl had never worked so physically hard in her life, but she refused to be a burden. She learned to tie knots that held, to haul on ropes until her muscles burned and her hands were raw. She worked alongside Silas, her quiet determination a match for his steady resolve. Her mule, Dust, became their indispensable partner, patiently carrying loads of rope, timber, and water up the steep, winding path to the rim. In the evenings, they would sit by their small fire, too tired to talk, watching the stars emerge over the vast, dark canyon. In these quiet moments, Pearl saw the man behind the silence. She saw the way he cared for his horse, the gentle way he spoke to her mule, the deep patience in his hands as he mended a frayed rope. He, in turn, saw the steel in her. He saw a woman who did not complain, who did not quit, who met every challenge with a squared jaw and a steady gaze. The respect between them grew. unspoken, but deeply felt. Late one afternoon, while Silas was reinforcing the anchors, Pearl took a small pouch of her tools and had him lower her down to the coach. She wanted to look at that metal plate again. Suspended in the quiet air, with the world spread out below her, she felt a sense of calm. She landed lightly on the stagecoach roof and made her way to the driver's box. The hidden plate was just as she'd left it. This time, she brought her tools. She took out a fine-tipped awl, its wooden handle worn smooth from her husband's hand, and then her own. Carefully, she worked the tip into the almost invisible seam between the plate and the wood. She pried gently. It didn't move. It wasn't a patch. It was a cover. She worked her way around the edge, applying steady pressure. With a faint scraping sound, the plate loosened. She lifted it away. Beneath it was not the expected grain of old wood. It was a circle of brass, dulled with a century of tarnish. And in the center of the brass was a small, intricate keyhole, a lock. Not on a strongbox, not on a door, but built into the very frame of the coach itself, a secret hidden within a secret. Her heart gave a sudden, powerful leap. This changed everything. The discovery of the lock electrified the air between them. It was proof of deliberate concealment, of a secret far more complex than a simple strongbox robbery. Silas, his face grim with concentration, examined the lock. "It's a warded lock," he said, his voice low. "Good quality for its time, not something a common outlaw would carry." They made a plan. The next day, Silas was lowered onto the wreck. He brought with him a small set of files and picks he had inherited from his father, a locksmith. Pearl remained on the rim, working the ropes, her entire being focused on the man dangling from them. Hours passed. The sun beat down on the canyon rim. From below, she could hear the faint, rhythmic scrape of metal on metal. It was a sound of painstaking effort, of a battle being fought in miniature. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. A long silence followed, so profound that Pearl could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Then, a voice floated up, faint but clear. "Pearl," there was a click. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and began to work the pulley, lowering herself down to join him. When she landed on the ledge, Silas was kneeling before the driver's box. A section of the floor beneath the seat, a piece that had looked like a solid part of the frame, was now slightly ajar. Using the tip of a crowbar, Silas gently pried it open. It lifted on hidden hinges, revealing a dark, lead-lined compartment. It wasn't a treasure chest. It was a vault, built into the bones of the coach. Inside, nestled in the darkness, were 6 canvas sacks, dark with age and heavy with promise. But that was not what seized Pearl's attention. Resting on top of the sacks, wrapped in a sheath of oilskin, was a leather-bound book. A ledger. With trembling hands, Pearl reached into the compartment and lifted out the book. The oilskin was still supple, its duty done. She unwrapped it. The leather cover was cold, the name of a San Francisco stationer embossed in faded gold leaf on its cover. Silas held a lantern close as she opened it, the pages whispering as they turned. The ink was brown with age, but the script was clear. The first page was a list of 6 names, the members of the Blackwood Gang. The second page was a detailed inventory, 212 pounds, 8 ounces, unminted gold dust and nuggets from the Mariposa claim, a fortune. Then she turned to the third page. The handwriting was different. It was finer, more elegant, the script of an educated man. The entry was dated 1 week after the robbery. It was a bill of sale. Sold, it began, to Mr. Alistair Thorne, the entire contents of this coach's vault for the sum of $500 coin, a map of the San Carlos Passage, and a promise of silence. Alistair Thorne, Jedediah's grandfather, the founding father of redemption. The ledger was not just a record of gold, it was a receipt for a town's original sin. The dead keep better ledgers than the living. Old Man Hemlock's words echoed in her mind, no longer a riddle, but a simple, terrible truth. They sat in stunned silence in the belly of the wrecked coach, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. The weight of the ledger in Pearl's hands felt heavier than any gold. It was the foundation of a town, the source of a family's power, and it was all a lie. As they absorbed the enormity of their discovery, the world outside the coach began to change. The sky, which had been a clear, benevolent blue, was turning a bruised, ominous purple in the west. A sudden, cold wind whipped through the canyon, making the old timbers of the coach groan in protest. "A squall," Silas said, his voice tight. "And we're in the worst possible place for it." Before they could even begin to secure their gear, the storm was upon them. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The ledge became a waterfall, and their platform swung wildly on its ropes. They were trapped. They huddled inside the wreck, the only shelter available. Pearl clutched the precious ledger, shielding it with her own body from the leaks that dripped through the rotted roof. The stagecoach, which had held its position for a century, shuddered and creaked, protesting the assault. Every gust of wind felt like a giant hand trying to tear it from its rocky perch. It was then, in a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire canyon, that they saw it. Far below, at the bottom of the gorge, the creek had become a raging river, and in the middle of it, a small farm wagon was overturned, its wheels spinning uselessly. A man was struggling in the torrent, trying to keep his footing, while a woman holding two small children clung to the wagon's side, their faces pale with terror in the intermittent flashes of light. A choice, stark and immediate, presented itself. Stay and protect their discovery, the proof and the fortune they had worked so hard for. Or risk everything, their ropes, their gear, their own lives to help complete strangers. There was no discussion. Pearl looked at Silas, his face set and grim in the lightning's glare. She saw the answer in his eyes, the same answer that was in her own heart. She gave a single, sharp nod. The gold could wait, the truth could wait, life could not. With a shared purpose that needed no words, they became a rescue team. Silas, with the calm competence of a man who had faced death before, began preparing the ropes. They had to work fast. The water was rising. In the heart of the storm, hanging from a cliff in a 100-year-old wreck, they made the choice to commit not to treasure, but to humanity. They would use the very tools of their discovery to attempt a desperate, improbable rescue. The ledger lay forgotten for a moment, its secrets less important than the sound of a child crying in the dark. The rescue was a nightmare of shouting, wind, and rain. Silas, a dark silhouette against the storm, orchestrated the effort with a calm authority that amazed Pearl. Using the main pulley system, they lowered a loop of rope with a heavy gear bag attached for weight. It swung like a pendulum, buffeted by the wind. It took them 4 agonizing attempts to get the rope close enough for the man below to grab. Once he had it, they worked in a desperate, synchronized rhythm. They hauled the 2 small, terrified children up first. One by one, their small bodies wrapped in a canvas sling Pearl had fashioned. Then came the mother, sobbing with relief and terror. Finally, they brought up the father, bruised and exhausted, but alive. They huddled together on the narrow ledge, a small group of shivering survivors, strangers brought together by disaster and a shared will to live. Pearl and Silas gave them their own dry blankets, sharing their meager rations of water and hard biscuit. They spent the rest of the night pressed together for warmth inside the groaning stagecoach, waiting for the storm to break. The immense value of the gold in the floorboards paling in comparison to the fragile, precious weight of the lives they had saved. When dawn finally came, it revealed a washed-out, mud-slicked world. The storm had passed. The family they had rescued was that of Judge Miller, the new circuit judge, on his way to his post in redemption. His wife, her face still pale but full of a fierce gratitude, couldn't stop thanking them. "You saved us," she kept repeating, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our children." The journey back to town was slow and arduous, but as they arrived, a strange thing happened. The story of the rescue, passed from the judge to the first rancher he encountered, had traveled faster than they had. When they rode into redemption, they were not met with the usual indifference or suspicion. People came out of the saloon, the store, the church. They stood in silence, watching them. The chorus of mockery that had followed Pearl was gone, replaced by a quiet, stunned respect. They were no longer the strange widow and the reclusive rancher. They were heroes. That afternoon, in the makeshift courtroom set up in the town hall, Pearl Harker stood before Judge Miller. Silas Vale stood at her side. She did not speak of gold. She did not speak of salvage rights. She simply placed the oilskin-wrapped ledger on the judge's table. "This was inside the coach, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I believe it belongs to the town." Judge Miller, a man whose life and family she had saved less than 24 hours earlier, opened the ledger. He read the first page, then the second, then the third. A deep silence fell over the crowded room. He summoned Jedediah Thorne. Thorne arrived, blustering and red-faced, his authority unquestioned until this very moment. He laughed when the judge showed him the ledger. A forgery, a ridiculous fantasy cooked up by a desperate woman and a washed-up lawman. But the proof was irrefutable. The elegant, spidery script of his grandfather, Alistair Thorne, was well documented in the town's founding papers. A sample of the gold dust from the coach was brought to the old assayer, who confirmed it matched the unique geological signature of the long-defunct Mariposa claim. The final piece of evidence was the character of the accusers. Judge Miller looked from the ledger to Pearl and Silas. "These two people," he announced to the room, his voice ringing with authority, "put the lives of my family above any thought of treasure. I will stake my own honor on theirs." The town was silent. Then the whispers started, a ripple of understanding that spread from person to person. The foundation of their world had shifted. Jedediah Thorne was not jailed. The crime was a century old. But he was broken. The wealth and power he had wielded were revealed as hollow, built on a bedrock of lies. He left the hall a smaller man, the crowd parting before him not in respect, but in judgment. The gold, the judge declared, belonged to Pearl Harker by right of salvage, a ruling no one in town dared to contest. Weeks later, the golden hour of a late autumn afternoon settled over the valley. The light was warm and thick, the color of honey, bathing the land in a soft, forgiving glow. Pearl Harker stood on a low ridge, her hands resting on a newly set fence post. She had used a portion of the gold to buy back her late husband's claim, and the section of land next to it, a wide pasture of good grass and running water that bordered Silas Vale's ranch. The two properties were now one, the line between them erased by a fence they had built together. She was no longer just a mender of tack, a widow living in a borrowed room. She was a landowner, her boots planted firmly on ground that was hers. Her mule Dust stood nearby, swatting flies with his tail, a picture of contentment. Silas came and stood beside her. He didn't speak for a long time, the two of them just watching the light crawl across the mountains. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a thing they shared, as comfortable and familiar as an old blanket. He finally reached out and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, a map of a hard life. Hers was the same. They fit together perfectly. He looked at her, then out at the vast, peaceful expanse of land stretching before them. "You did more than find gold, Pearl," he said, his voice quiet. She looked down at their joined hands, then back out at the valley, at the two small houses that now looked like neighbors. A deep sense of peace, one she thought she had lost forever, settled into her bones. She had come to this place with nothing, seeking only to be left alone. She had found a treasure, yes, but it was not the gold that mattered. It was the truth the gold had revealed, the strength she had found in herself, the partner she had found in this quiet, steady man. "We found solid ground," she replied. "Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey. It's a story that reminds us that true wealth is found not in what we unearth from the ground, but in the courage and character we build within ourselves. If you were moved by Pearl's story, please leave a like and let us know your favorite part in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are always more stories of hidden strength waiting to be told.